in those instances where you had first contact with peoples in Melanesia who may not have seen Westerners before, did they also have, I'm not sure how you communicated, but did they also have some feeling that their borders were becoming, closer and closer to them, and that the outside world was really coming in and things were changing rapidly? Or did they not see that happening?
Oh, look, it varied. So just to give you two examples, and they're quite different in context, really. But among the Myanmar people in Sundown Province, which is kind of Western Papua New Guinea, I made a couple of first contacts in that area, and those people, they had a very strong sense that they were the last; they'd been left behind, and they really didn't have a way of reaching out into the world. So it was really interesting with those people. Very different to the situation in West Papua, which is part of Indonesia, where I was working in areas where there had been historic contact, but there was no Indonesian government established. Those people were desperately trying to defend themselves against the ingression of the Indonesian military and sort of like the frontier wars of Australia in the 1850s. And the main community I worked with then no longer exists. I mean, those people have died or moved out. There's just a huge military base there now.
Wow. Okay.
So, and that's just in the last 20 years. So it's varied. The experience of those people is varied.
Have you had, have there been sort of success stories where groups have managed to, have you been in contact with groups for over 20 years and seen them develop and somehow successfully deal with the encroachment? Or
yeah, absolutely. For example, in the Solomon Islands, which is the most recent project that I've been working on, I worked with Kwaio people, and the Kwaio have had a particular history, a really sad colonial history. So back in the 1920s, they killed British and Australian colonial officers and about 15 highly armed policemen who'd come to collect tax. And the Australian government responded by sending a battleship and an army into their area to try to kill them or discipline them, failed miserably, and then armed their tribal enemies. And so for decades, these people suffered and cut the outside world off completely. They just would have nothing to do with it. And I started working there in the 80s, very, very fortunate to be able to go into that country. It was just a unique opportunity to get in there. But then about 5 years ago, I was invited to come back in and do some work. I managed to get some grant money out of Europe, and we set up a conservation program, but also a huge a reconciliation ceremony. So there was hundreds of people have been killed in this war, and as far as the Kwaio were concerned, it was still ongoing, So the last Australian they killed, or any of the Kwaio killed, was back in 2013, I think, or 2015, around about there. Guy was beheaded as part of this tribal war. And so we had to have a huge reconciliation ceremony where we paid compensation for the hundreds of people who died. We went through a day-long ceremony. It was quite amazing.
Was it pretty hairy originally when you entered the territory? Or, did you need some sort of protection? How was that organized?
I was very fortunate that I met the son of one of the chiefs, a man called Folofo. His son, who I knew as Simon, but that wasn't his real name, had come into Honiara, and a friend of mine had given him a Swiss Army knife, and he was a bit overwhelmed at the gift and invited us back to his country. So we were there under his protection. So that was really just an amazing experience to get up there and see. People living totally traditionally, no Western clothes, no Western goods, just, I've never seen anything like it, The sacred men's house still there. It was just amazing. So anyway, when I went back 5 years ago, it was the same sort of thing. We had this incredible ceremony deep in the bush, 1,000 meters up in the mountains. I wasn't allowed to wear clothes for 10 days. I had to wear a leaf like everyone else. And the guy who conducted the ceremony, he's an amazing man. He'd been preparing for 6 months to do the ceremony, and he on the day of the ceremony, he wore a string of human teeth around his neck.
Wow.
And quite incredible. And it was just, I was dense way in the forest, and he started chanting. And it was the list of names, just chanting all of the names of everyone who'd been killed. And every time a name was mentioned, some one of the 30 or so very senior Kwaio men who were part of it, you'd hear a wail or a groan or someone had fallen to the ground because that was the name of their son or their father that had been killed,
Mhm.
and from that moment on, they weren't allowed to take revenge. So it was this incredible ceremony. But anyway, that was, something
Okay.
quite else. But we had to do that in order to be able to safely send researchers up into the area to start the conservation work.
And what form of compensation? Is it monetary or?
No, pigs and shell money, which is monetary for them, but yeah, shell money, which is highly valuable.
And the human teeth, is that people who were victims of this war, or?
I didn't ask.
Okay.
I just saw that.
You thought maybe it wasn't tactically maybe better not to ask, perhaps.
Well, it was the ceremony wasn't about the teeth. I was pretty deeply engaged in just doing my bit for this ceremony.
What an amazing experience. I imagine, I mean, this is an experience that you really can't have again as the world opens up, right?
No, this is I'd been working in Melanesia for 40 years by that time, and I'd never been accepted into the heart of Melanesian culture like that. It was quite incredible.
Were you able to record?
No, the ceremony itself we couldn't record, couldn't photograph, nothing. But there was 10 days of events, and we did record quite a lot around. I should say there was a series of ceremonies that took place. So the ultra sacred one in the sacred grove where the ancestors' skulls are and stuff, that we couldn't record.
Yes.
But back in the village, we had a compensation ceremony where I had to pay compensation for the 7 Kwaio who had been hung by the British, and they paid me compensation for the Australians and British that they'd killed. So that was all. We could record that, and that was all done, recorded.
Wow. I didn't realize. I guess this is not really first contact because they were aware.
Sorry, lost my earpiece.
No worries. I suppose that's not really first contact because they were aware of white people. They may not have individually have seen white people.